Doctor humiliates Keanu Reeves without knowing he owns the hospital. Keanu Reeves was not someone who liked to draw attention to himself, despite his fame. Unlike many other celebrities who thrived on the spotlight, Keanu preferred a quieter, more private life. It was rare for him to visit a hospital, but today was different. He had been feeling a little under the weather recently, and though he wasn't one to complain, he knew it was time for a checkup. So without any fanfare or entourage, he walked into the doors of an upscale private hospital in a small part of the city, looking just like any other patient. The hospital was modern and sleek, with clean, polished floors that reflected the soft lighting. It had a calming atmosphere, something Keanu appreciated. The smell of fresh flowers filled the air, and the sound of soft classical music played quietly in the background. It was the kind of place where people expected high-quality care and privacy, and Keanu had chosen this hospital because of its reputation for excellent service. He dressed casually in a simple black hoodie and jeans, with a pair of dark sunglasses perched on his face. His unassuming appearance allowed him to blend in easily with the other patients. No one would guess that the quiet man walking through the lobby was not just another wealthy individual seeking treatment, but in fact, the owner of the hospital. Keanu liked to keep it that way. For him, it wasn't about status or recognition. It was about the care and compassion that the hospital provided to those who walked through its doors. Keanu checked in at the reception desk, where the staff, as usual, greeted him politely. The receptionist didn't seem to recognize him at first, which was just the way Keanu liked it. He didn't want special treatment, just the same standard of care as any other person. After filling out the necessary paperwork, he was directed to the waiting area, where a few other patients were seated. There was no rush or urgency in his movements. He sat down calmly, pulling out his phone to check his messages as he waited for his appointment. The waiting area was serene, with comfortable chairs and soft, muted colors. It was a quiet, peaceful space where people could relax before seeing their doctors. Keanu noticed a few familiar faces, other well-known people in the area, none of whom made a scene or tried to attract attention. In fact, it was the perfect environment for someone like him who preferred a low profile. As he glanced around, he couldn't help but feel grateful for the calm atmosphere the hospital provided, something rare in his high-profile life. Minutes later, Keanu's name was called by the nurse, and he stood up, walking calmly toward the consultation room. The nurse, a young woman with a friendly smile, led him down a hallway lined with artwork and potted plants. She didn't give him a second glance, which suited him just fine. She was there to do her job, not to be impressed by his fame. Keanu preferred it that way. He didn't need anyone fawning over him. When they arrived at the door of the consultation room, the nurse opened it and gestured for him to enter. Keanu stepped inside, expecting a standard examination. The doctor who was supposed to see him today was Dr. Thomas, a highly recommended physician known for his sharp mind and no-nonsense attitude. However, Keanu had never met him before, so he had no idea what to expect. He took a seat in the chair, smoothing his hoodie as he waited for the doctor. Dr. Thomas entered shortly after, and Keanu immediately noticed something about him. There was a certain arrogance in his stride, a confidence that bordered on cockiness. He was tall, with a clean-cut appearance and a self-assured look in his eyes. Dr. Thomas looked Keanu over quickly, assessing him with a sharp gaze before offering a brief handshake. He didn't seem particularly warm, but Keanu didn't mind. He was used to doctors who were focused more on the job than on making small talk. "Mr. Reeves," Dr. Thomas said, his voice smooth but professional. "I'm Dr. Thomas. I'll be taking care of you today. What seems to be the problem?" Keanu hesitated for a moment, then calmly explained his symptoms. He had been feeling a little fatigued, with occasional headaches and a sense of dizziness. It wasn't anything major, but he wanted to make sure there wasn't something more serious going on. He wasn't one to make a fuss, but he also understood the importance of staying healthy. After all, there were a lot of things he needed to take care of, especially the hospital he had built from the ground up. Dr. Thomas didn't seem to be paying full attention. Instead of focusing on Keanu's concerns, he was quickly scanning the medical chart. He didn't ask any follow-up questions or offer much in the way of reassurance. Instead, he seemed to be running through the motions, as if this was just another routine consultation. Keanu could sense that the doctor was more interested in getting through the appointment quickly than in truly understanding what he was experiencing. "So, you've been feeling tired and having some headaches," Dr. Thomas said, barely looking up from his notes. "I see. Well, that's fairly common. It's probably just stress or lack of sleep. I would suggest you try to get more rest and maybe see a therapist if you're feeling overwhelmed." Keanu nodded, but something in the way Dr. Thomas spoke rubbed him the wrong way. The doctor had assumed, without asking more questions, that Keanu's symptoms were simply a result of stress. There was no real effort to consider other possibilities. Keanu, though calm and collected, didn't appreciate the dismissive tone. He had come to the hospital for answers, not to be brushed off. "Are you sure it's just stress?" Keanu asked, his voice polite but firm. "I've been feeling this way for a while now and it doesn't seem to be getting better, doctor." Thomas glanced up from his notes for a moment, then gave a half-hearted shrug. "Well, it's pretty common for people like you to be stressed. You're probably just overworking yourself. It happens to a lot of wealthy people, and it's nothing to be concerned about." Keanu's eyebrows furrowed slightly. There it was, the assumption that his symptoms were nothing more than the result of his social status. The way Dr. Thomas spoke suggested that he had already made up his mind about Keanu's situation without truly listening. This was not the kind of care Keanu expected from the hospital he had invested so much into. "I'm not so sure about that," Keanu replied, his voice steady but with a slight edge of frustration. "I don't think this is just stress, doctor." Thomas didn't seem to notice the change in tone. Instead, he continued his examination, barely acknowledging Keanu's concerns. It became clear to Keanu that this doctor was more interested in his own sense of superiority than in providing thoughtful care. He felt like a number, not a patient. Keanu sat quietly, waiting for the appointment to end. He wasn't one to cause a scene, but the longer the doctor dismissed his concerns, the more he realized that something needed to change, both for his own sake and for the sake of the hospital he had helped create. As the appointment neared its end, Dr. Thomas handed Keanu a prescription for rest and recommended a few lifestyle changes. He seemed to think the issue was resolved, but Keanu wasn't so sure. He didn't know it yet, but this seemingly small encounter would lead to a chain of events that would change everything, both for him and for Dr. Thomas. The appointment was not going as Keanu had hoped. As Dr. Thomas continued his dismissive attitude, Keanu could feel the tension building. It wasn't about the symptoms anymore. It was about how he was being treated. He had come to this hospital because he trusted its reputation and the quality of care it promised. But in that small consultation room, with Dr. Thomas hardly paying attention to him, Keanu began to question whether that reputation was deserved. The more the doctor spoke, the more Keanu felt as though he was just another patient being shuffled through the system. He had expected professionalism, empathy, and at least a modicum of interest in his well-being, but instead, he was receiving none of that. Dr. Thomas seemed to be in a rush, more focused on completing his task than on the person sitting in front of him. Keanu had been through countless checkups before. Being in the public eye, he was used to doctors and specialists examining him for everything from routine tests to more complicated procedures. He knew that doctors could be busy, but this was different. There was something about the way Dr. Thomas spoke to him that felt particularly off-putting. He was not a patient in this moment. He was simply a name on a chart. The doctor continued to talk, now suggesting that Keanu take some vitamins or change his diet. It was standard advice, something most people had heard a dozen times before. But Keanu was not like most people. His health was important to him, and he didn't want to be treated like a faceless individual. He wanted someone who would listen to him, someone who would take the time to understand his concerns. As Dr. Thomas moved on to the next point, Keanu found himself zoning out, his mind drifting as the doctor's voice became more of a distant hum. He couldn't help but feel that this was just the type of encounter many patients had to endure, but it was especially frustrating when you knew the doctor's behavior wasn't just casual negligence. It was a lack of respect. Keanu glanced down at the prescription pad doctor. Thomas was scribbling on. The words were meaningless to him. He had expected a thorough checkup, perhaps even some tests to ensure there was no underlying condition that might be causing his symptoms. But there was nothing in the doctor's approach that reflected any real effort to get to the bottom of the problem. "Maybe a little more sleep, less stress," Dr. Thomas continued, not looking up. And if that doesn't help, then we can talk about some stronger medications. His voice was dismissive, as though he had already solved the problem with just a few words. Keanu had tried to explain that the symptoms were ongoing, but it felt as though Dr. Thomas was simply brushing him off. The suggestion of medications without any clear reasoning made him wonder whether the doctor had actually listened to what he had said. Keanu's thoughts were interrupted by the doctor standing up, ready to end the appointment. Keanu remained seated, his mind working through the frustration he felt. It was rare for him to experience such a lack of attention from a professional, especially one in charge of the health and well-being of so many patients. But what was even more frustrating was that this wasn't just any doctor. This was the very person the hospital had entrusted to provide care to its patients. It was becoming increasingly clear that Dr. Thomas wasn't just lacking in attention to Keanu's needs. He was assuming things based on superficial judgments. This irritated Keanu more than anything. He wasn't some pampered celebrity who wanted to be treated differently. He was a man with real concerns about his health. But Dr. Thomas saw him as nothing more than another high-maintenance patient. Keanu could feel his patience starting to wear thin, but he didn't want to make a scene. He was well aware that it wasn't just about this particular appointment. His mind started to drift to the bigger picture, the hospital itself, the commitment he had made to provide quality care for everyone who walked through its doors. Just as Keanu was about to speak, Dr. Thomas picked up his notes and turned towards the door, signaling that the consultation was finished. "All right, Mr. Reeves, just follow the instructions and you should be fine," Dr. Thomas said, as though the matter were already settled. His voice was final, as if the discussion had already been closed, with no room for further questions or concerns. Keanu stood up slowly, his mind racing. He didn't say anything at first. He didn't want to react in the heat of the moment. Instead, he walked toward the door, ready to leave the room and the appointment behind. But something told him this wouldn't be the last time he would have to deal with Dr. Thomas. His mind kept returning to the way the doctor had dismissed his concerns without truly listening. Keanu knew that he wouldn't just let this go. As he exited the consultation room, Keanu felt a wave of disappointment wash over him. He had hoped for a more professional, empathetic experience. It wasn't just about the medical care he had received, or rather hadn't received. It was about the respect that seemed to be lacking from the very people who were supposed to be providing it. The fact that he had been treated like just another patient on the conveyor belt was deeply unsettling. Keanu made his way down the hall to the waiting area. His mind was still occupied with the encounter. He had been in situations like this before, where people underestimated him or assumed things based on his fame or wealth. But this felt different. This wasn't about being famous. This was about the quality of care, the way patients should be treated with respect, regardless of who they were. He sat back down in the waiting area, the discomfort from the appointment still lingering. He looked around at the other patients, wondering if any of them were feeling the same way he had. Did they also feel like their concerns were being dismissed? Did they feel like they weren't being heard? The thought made him uneasy, and for the first time he questioned whether this hospital, which he had built from the ground up, was truly living up to the standards he had set for it. As he sat there, reflecting on the appointment, Keanu couldn't help but wonder what Dr. Thomas's attitude toward his patients really was. He had been a part of this hospital for years, but this encounter made him realize that maybe there were bigger issues beneath the surface. Perhaps the doctor's behavior was not an isolated incident, but a reflection of a larger problem within the system, a lack of empathy and care for the very people who needed it the most. Keanu sat in silence, lost in thought. He had learned something important today. Sometimes, even the smallest interactions could reveal much more than they seemed on the surface. What had started as a routine checkup had turned into a realization that Keanu could no longer ignore the importance of ensuring that every patient who walked into this hospital felt valued, heard, and cared for, not just as a number or a source of revenue, but as a human being. The appointment had been awkward and frustrating, but it had also sparked something in Keanu. He knew that change was needed, not just for himself, but for the future of the hospital and everyone who came through its doors. The question now was how to address the problem, and how far he was willing to go to make things right. As Keanu walked out of the consultation room, The weight of the appointment lingered heavily on him. He had expected a professional and thorough examination, but instead, he had been met with dismissiveness and condescension. It wasn't just the lack of proper care that bothered him. It was the way he had been treated, as though his concerns didn't matter. It wasn't until that moment that he truly realized how important it was to be treated with respect, regardless of who you were. Keanu, known for his humility and calm demeanor, had often been subjected to unwanted attention in the past. He had grown accustomed to being treated differently by others because of his fame, wealth, and reputation. But this time was different. He wasn't just another celebrity being brushed off. He was the owner of the hospital, someone who had built this place with the intention of providing the best care to people, no matter who they were. It was a personal project for him, something he poured his heart into. The fact that a doctor in his own hospital had treated him with such disregard felt like a betrayal. As he made his way down the hallway, his mind raced with thoughts of how to handle the situation. He knew that he couldn't let this slide. It wasn't just about him. It was about the future of the hospital and the thousands of people who relied on it for care. Keanu wasn't the kind of person to raise a scene or make things about himself, but he understood that this was a moment where action needed to be taken. He arrived at the hospital's executive office, where the senior management team was meeting. Keanu had been there many times before, but this time, he felt a sense of urgency he hadn't felt in years. He knocked on the door and entered without waiting for a response. The room fell silent as the staff inside turned to face him. The CEO, the director of operations, and a few other key members of the hospital's management team were seated around a large conference table. They all recognized Keanu immediately, but there was no sign of surprise or panic. They knew he was the owner, but they also understood that Keanu was a private person who rarely got involved in the day-to-day workings of the hospital. "Keanu, is everything okay?" the CEO asked, his voice calm but concerned. Keanu looked around the room, his gaze firm and composed. "I just had an appointment with Dr. Thomas," he said, his voice steady but carrying a hint of disappointment. "And I'm not happy with how it went." The room fell quiet. The CEO looked at him with a raised eyebrow, clearly surprised that Keanu was taking such an interest in the day-to-day operations of the hospital. It wasn't typical for him to involve himself in these kinds of issues, and the staff was used to his hands-off approach. But today was different. Keanu had been a patient, and he had just experienced something that made him question the hospital's standards. "Can you tell us what happened?" the CEO asked carefully, his tone now more measured. Keanu took a deep breath, still feeling the weight of the appointment. "Dr. Thomas didn't take my concerns seriously," he explained. "He dismissed my symptoms as nothing more than stress, and didn't listen when I tried to explain that they were ongoing. He didn't make any effort to properly examine me or even consider other possibilities. It felt like he was just rushing me through the appointment without any real care or attention." The staff exchanged uneasy glances. They had always known Dr. Thomas to be competent, but they also knew that he had a reputation for being blunt and somewhat indifferent. His approach to patient care was efficient, but not necessarily warm. However, no one had expected this kind of complaint from Keanu, especially considering the high standards the hospital aimed to maintain. Keanu continued, his voice calm but firm. "It's not just about my appointment. It's about the kind of care we're providing here. I built this hospital to help people, not to treat them like they're just another number on a list. We need to make sure every patient feels heard, valued, and respected. Doctor Thomas didn't do that, and frankly, I'm concerned that if this is happening to me, it's probably happening to other people too." The CEO nodded slowly, processing Keanu's words. "I understand, Keanu. We'll look into it," he said. "But we've always had high marks for Dr. Thomas. He's been with us for years." Keanu shook his head. "High marks don't matter if the patients aren't receiving the care they deserve. We can't afford to let people feel like they're being ignored or treated like they don't matter. Not in this hospital, not on my watch." The room was silent for a moment as the management team absorbed what Keanu was saying. The weight of his words hung in the air, and it became clear that this wasn't just a minor issue. It was a serious matter that needed to be addressed. Keanu wasn't just an owner with a financial interest in the hospital. He was someone who genuinely cared about its mission and the people who came through its doors. His words had the power to change the course of the hospital's future, and everyone in the room knew that. "I agree," the CEO said finally. "We'll conduct an internal review and address this with Dr. Thomas. If there are systemic issues with the way patients are being treated, we'll fix it. We want to make sure this kind of thing doesn't happen again." Keanu nodded, feeling a sense of relief. "Good. I don't want to make an example out of anyone, but I also don't want to compromise on the principles this hospital was founded on. We owe it to our patients to give them the best care possible." The CEO stood up and walked over to Keanu, offering a hand. "I appreciate your input, Keanu. We'll take this seriously." Keanu shook the CEO's hand but didn't smile. He was still processing everything that had happened, but he felt a renewed sense of purpose. This hospital wasn't just a business to him. It was a place where people came for help, and he wouldn't let it become a factory for treating people like numbers. It was his responsibility to make sure that every patient received the attention and care they deserved, no matter who they were. As Keanu left the meeting room, his mind was already turning to the next steps. He knew he couldn't just let this issue slide. It wasn't about one doctor's behavior. It was about setting a standard for the entire hospital. If Dr. Thomas was acting this way, who else was? Were there other doctors, nurses, or staff members who were neglecting the hospital's core values? Keanu's resolve grew stronger with each step he took. He wasn't going to let this issue fester. He would ensure that every patient, no matter their background or social status, felt valued and cared for. It was the right thing to do, and it was the reason he had built this hospital in the first place. Keanu Reeves walked down the hall with a sense of purpose that hadn't been there before. The meeting with the hospital management had left him feeling a little more at ease, but there was still a nagging feeling in the back of his mind. He had spoken his mind, but now he needed to act. It wasn't enough to just express his concerns. Keanu knew that change needed to happen, and it needed to happen quickly. But the thought of confronting Dr. Thomas was something he had been putting off. He wasn't one for confrontation, and he certainly didn't want to make a spectacle of himself, but the events of the morning had made it clear that something had to give. As Keanu approached Dr. Thomas's office, he paused for a moment outside the door. He could hear muffled voices from inside. Dr. Thomas was likely speaking to one of his colleagues or handling some other matter. Keanu stood still for a moment, considering how to approach the situation. He wasn't angry, but he was disappointed. The last thing he wanted was to cause a stir or make someone feel ashamed. But he knew that if the hospital was to live up to its ideals, Dr. Thomas needed to understand the impact of his actions. Keanu took a deep breath, then knocked lightly on the door. The sound echoed in the quiet hallway, and he could feel a slight tension in the air as the voices inside went silent. A moment later, the door swung open, revealing Dr. Thomas. He seemed surprised to see Keanu standing there, but quickly masked it with his usual confident, slightly aloof expression. "Oh, Mr. Reeves," Dr. Thomas said, a little too cheerfully. "I wasn't expecting you. What can I do for you?" Keanu, though calm, couldn't help but notice the abrupt shift in the doctor's tone. It was almost as though Dr. Thomas had been caught off guard, not expecting someone of Keanu's stature to show up at his door. It was in moments like these that Keanu realized how people often underestimated him, not out of malice, but out of their own preconceived notions about his fame. It wasn't uncommon for people to think of him as just another celebrity, when in reality he was so much more than that. "I need to talk to you," Keanu said, his voice steady but firm. "Can we sit down?" Dr. Thomas stepped aside, allowing Keanu to enter the office. The room was cluttered with paperwork and medical files, an organized chaos that hinted at Dr. Thomas's busy schedule. He gestured to the chair opposite his desk and sat down, waiting for Keanu to speak. Keanu took a seat and looked at the doctor for a moment before speaking. He didn't want to rush into the conversation, but he also didn't want to delay the inevitable. He knew that confronting Dr. Thomas was important for the sake of the hospital, but it was also important for him personally. "You probably don't know this," Keanu began, "but I'm not just another patient here. I own this hospital. I built it from the ground up with the goal of providing the best care for everyone who walks through these doors, no matter who they are or where they come from." Doctor Thomas's expression shifted, and Keanu could see a flicker of recognition in his eyes. The confident, somewhat arrogant demeanor from before began to fade, replaced with an uneasy silence. It was clear that Dr. Thomas hadn't expected Keanu to be the one to own the hospital. It was a bit of a revelation, one that had the potential to change the way the doctor viewed their interaction. "I'm not here to lecture you or make a scene," Keanu continued. "But I've got to be honest with you. I wasn't happy with how my appointment went this morning. In fact, I was disappointed." Dr. Thomas shifted in his seat, his posture straightening slightly. He wasn't used to being called out, especially by someone of Keanu's caliber. Keanu's words seemed to hang in the air, but he wasn't going to back down. He had come this far, and now it was time to make sure Dr. Thomas understood the gravity of the situation. "You dismissed my concerns," Keanu said, keeping his tone calm but direct. "You assumed it was just stress, without taking the time to really listen to me or consider other possibilities. You didn't do your job the way you should have, and I know that I'm not the only person you've treated this way." Doctor Thomas opened his mouth as if to respond, but then paused. He seemed to realize that there was no easy way to explain his behavior. Instead, he just looked at Keanu, clearly struggling to find the right words. The silence in the room grew thicker. "I built this hospital with the understanding that patients would be treated with care and respect," Keanu went on, his voice steady. "Not just the patients who have money or fame, but every single person who comes here. It's not about what they can give us, it's about the service we provide, the treatment we offer." Dr. Thomas remained quiet, clearly uncomfortable. He had never been in a position where his professionalism had been questioned so directly, especially not by someone like Keanu. But Keanu wasn't interested in making Dr. Thomas feel small. He wanted him to understand the responsibility that came with being a doctor, with being part of a system that was built on trust and compassion. "I'm not angry," Keanu said, his tone softening just slightly. "But I'm disappointed. I want to know that the people I've entrusted with this hospital are treating each patient as an individual, not just another case to get through." Dr. Thomas seemed to grasp the weight of Keanu's words. He took a deep breath, then finally spoke, his voice less confident than before. "You're right," he said quietly. "I should have been more attentive. I've been under a lot of pressure lately, and I guess I let that affect my behavior. I didn't mean to dismiss you, but I can see how I did. I'm sorry for that." Keanu nodded, appreciating the apology, though he knew there was still work to be done. It wasn't enough for Dr. Thomas to simply apologize. Keanu wanted to see real change. He wanted to ensure that this kind of incident didn't happen again, to him or to any other patient. "I'll tell you what," Keanu said, leaning forward slightly. "I'm not going to make this a bigger issue than it is. But I need you to understand that this kind of thing can't happen again. Not here, not in this hospital. I expect you to reflect on this and make sure that you treat every patient with the attention and respect they deserve." Doctor Thomas nodded again, this time with more sincerity. "I will. I understand, Mr. Reeves. I won't let it happen again." Keanu stood up, feeling a sense of resolution. He had said what needed to be said, and now it was up to Dr. Thomas to take responsibility for his actions. Keanu wasn't one to dwell on negative moments, but he knew that confronting the issue head-on was the only way to ensure that it wouldn't happen again. "I'm counting on you," Keanu said, his voice firm but not unkind. "Take this seriously. We're here to help people, not make them feel worse." Dr. Thomas nodded, his expression now one of genuine understanding. As Keanu walked out of the office, he felt a sense of closure. It hadn't been easy to confront Dr. Thomas, but he knew it was the right thing to do. It was the first step in ensuring that the hospital remained a place where people could feel safe and cared for, no matter their background or their status. Keanu had built the hospital for a reason, and he wasn't about to let anything compromise the mission he had set out to accomplish. The next few days at the hospital were filled with tension. Keanu had spoken to Dr. Thomas, and while the doctor had apologized, Keanu knew that words alone wouldn't be enough to change anything. It was one thing for Dr. Thomas to acknowledge his mistake, but Keanu needed to make sure the lesson was learned, not just by him, but by everyone at the hospital. This wasn't just about one doctor's behavior. It was about the entire culture of care and respect that the hospital needed to embody. Keanu wasn't going to let this slip through the cracks. The CEO of the hospital had assured Keanu that an internal review would be conducted, but Keanu wasn't going to just sit back and wait for things to improve on their own. He made it clear that he expected a thorough investigation into the incident, and that it was only the beginning of a larger process. He wanted to ensure that every doctor, nurse, and staff member understood the importance of providing compassionate, attentive care to every patient. No exceptions. Keanu wasn't about to let the hospital slide back into old habits. He'd built it to be a place of healing, not just a business. It was a responsibility he took seriously, and now, more than ever, he knew that his commitment to it needed to be unwavering. But even with all his focus on the larger mission, Keanu couldn't help but feel a personal stake in the outcome of this situation. His reputation was on the line, and more importantly, so was the trust of everyone who walked through those hospital doors. Within a week of his meeting with Dr. Thomas, Keanu was informed that the internal review had been completed. The CEO and senior management team had conducted interviews with several patients, as well as members of the hospital staff, to gather a clearer picture of the work environment. They had even checked to see if there had been any other complaints about Dr. Thomas's behavior, and while nothing as serious as what Keanu had experienced came up, there were some troubling patterns. It turned out that Dr. Thomas, despite his clinical skills, had been known for his cold and often dismissive demeanor. While he had always received high marks in terms of his medical expertise, his interpersonal skills left much to be desired. Several patients had mentioned that they felt brushed off by him, but none had taken the step to formally complain. The pattern was clear. Dr. Thomas had developed a habit of rushing through appointments, assuming that his medical knowledge was enough to make up for a lack of genuine care for his patients. Keanu felt a mix of emotions when he received the results of the review. On one hand, it was reassuring to know that the issues with Dr. Thomas weren't as widespread as he feared. On the other hand, it was disturbing to realize that this kind of behavior had been allowed to go unchecked for so long. The hospital had a high standard for patient care, but somewhere along the way, it had been compromised by a few individuals who had taken their positions for granted. Keanu knew that change was necessary. Dr. Thomas had to be held accountable, but it couldn't stop there. If the hospital was to continue to thrive and provide the level of care that Keanu had envisioned, there needed to be a broader culture shift. The hospital needed to become a place where every patient felt heard, respected, and valued, not just as a customer, but as a person. Keanu met with the CEO and senior management to discuss the next steps. It was clear that Dr. Thomas would need to undergo a serious evaluation of his work and his approach to patient care. But Keanu also knew that simply reprimanding Dr. Thomas wouldn't be enough. The hospital needed a program to address these kinds of issues before they became serious problems. They needed to invest in training and development for their medical staff, focusing on empathy, communication, and patient-centered care. "We can't afford to let this slide," Keanu told the CEO. "We built this hospital to help people, not just treat their symptoms. We have a responsibility to ensure that our staff understands that treating patients is about more than just medicine. It's about making them feel heard, cared for, and respected." The CEO nodded in agreement. "We've always prided ourselves on our medical expertise, but we can't ignore the human side of things. This review is a wake-up call. We'll implement new policies to address this issue and make sure all of our staff undergoes training on how to treat patients with compassion." Keanu appreciated the CEO's commitment to change, but he knew that actions spoke louder than words. He wasn't going to let the hospital fall into complacency again. He insisted that the hospital adopt a more proactive approach to patient care, including regular feedback surveys for patients, and that any staff member who received negative reviews about their attitude or behavior would be required to attend additional training. "We need to create a culture of accountability," Keanu said. "Everyone needs to know that their behavior matters. If we let these small issues slide, they'll grow into bigger problems, and that's not something I'm willing to risk." The management team agreed with Keanu's vision, and they immediately began to implement the changes. Dr. Thomas was given a formal reprimand, and he was required to attend a series of workshops focused on improving his communication and patient care skills. He was told that his continued employment at the hospital depended on his willingness to make improvements. Dr. Thomas, though reluctant at first, understood the seriousness of the situation. He had always prided himself on his medical skills, but Keanu's intervention made him realize that being a good doctor wasn't just about having the right knowledge. It was about how you treated people. In the following months, Keanu closely monitored the hospital's progress. He made surprise visits, checked patient satisfaction surveys, and spoke with staff members to gauge how well the new programs were being received. To his relief, the changes began to take hold. Staff members who had once been indifferent to patient feedback now took it seriously. Doctors and nurses became more engaged with their patients, and the hospital's reputation for compassionate care grew stronger. Keanu felt a deep sense of satisfaction as he watched the culture shift. It was slow, but it was happening, and that was all that mattered. The incident with Dr. Thomas had turned out to be a turning point for the hospital. What had begun as a small issue had blossomed into a larger opportunity for growth and improvement. Keanu realized that while he could never predict when challenges would arise, he could always count on his ability to face them head-on and make things better. For Keanu, the lesson was clear. Building something meaningful wasn't just about creating a place for people to receive medical treatment. It was about creating a place where they felt like they mattered, where their concerns were heard, their needs were met, and their dignity was upheld. That was the kind of hospital he had always envisioned, and now, thanks to his decision to confront Dr. Thomas, it was becoming a reality. The weeks that followed were a mix of reflection and action for both Dr. Thomas and the hospital staff. While the changes had been put into motion, Keanu knew that true transformation would take time. He had always believed in second chances, especially for those who were willing to learn from their mistakes and improve. Dr. Thomas's situation was no different. It wasn't just about punishing him for his behavior. It was about helping him understand what had gone wrong and giving him the tools to do better in the future. Keanu had made it clear during their conversation that this wasn't a personal attack on Dr. Thomas. He understood the pressure that came with being a doctor, the long hours, the stress, and the constant need to make life-altering decisions on a daily basis. But none of that justified the way Dr. Thomas had treated him, or, as Keanu suspected, other patients as well. It was up to Dr. Thomas now to take responsibility for his actions and prove that he could be better. As part of his commitment to change, Dr. Thomas was required to attend a series of workshops that focused on developing communication skills, improving bedside manner, and learning how to better connect with patients on a personal level. These workshops weren't just about learning medical knowledge, they were about learning empathy, something that was equally important when treating people. Dr. Thomas had always prided himself on his medical knowledge, but he began to realize that his approach to patients needed to be more than just technical proficiency. He needed to understand the emotional and psychological aspects of healing. At first, Dr. Thomas was resistant to the idea. He wasn't used to being told that he needed to change. He had been a successful doctor for many years, and his reputation had always been based on his expertise and efficiency. But as he attended the workshops, something started to shift. He began to see the value in truly listening to patients and recognizing that their emotional well-being was just as important as their physical health. It wasn't enough to simply treat symptoms. He needed to treat the person as a whole. During one of the workshops, Dr. Thomas was asked to sit down with a patient volunteer, someone who had experienced poor treatment in the past and was willing to share their story. The exercise was meant to challenge doctors to step into the patient's shoes and experience firsthand what it felt like to be treated as a number rather than a person. Dr. Thomas listened as the patient spoke about their experiences, recounting how they had felt dismissed and overlooked during their own appointments. The words were powerful, and for the first time, Dr. Thomas felt the full weight of his actions. As he listened, Dr. Thomas began to feel a deep sense of regret. He hadn't meant to cause harm, but he had done so, and now he understood why it was so important to approach every patient with the care and respect they deserved. This was a turning point for him. He realized that being a good doctor wasn't just about curing diseases. It was about creating an environment where patients felt heard, safe, and valued. Keanu had always believed in the power of empathy and understanding. It was something that had shaped his own life and career. He knew that Dr. Thomas wasn't a bad person. He was simply someone who had lost sight of the bigger picture. Keanu's intervention, though difficult, had created an opportunity for growth, not just for Dr. Thomas, but for the entire hospital. As time passed, Dr. Thomas started to change. He began to engage more deeply with his patients, taking the time to ask questions, listen to their concerns, and provide the kind of care that went beyond just the physical aspects of healing. His demeanor softened, and his once impersonal approach was replaced by a more compassionate one. Patients began to notice the difference, and many even took the time to leave positive feedback, something that had been rare in the past. But Dr. Thomas's transformation wasn't just about his interactions with patients. It was about his approach to his colleagues as well. He began to foster a more collaborative environment with the other doctors and staff members, encouraging open communication and a team-based approach to patient care. The changes he had made to his own practice rippled through the hospital, creating a culture where everyone felt valued and respected. Keanu kept a close eye on the progress, checking in with the management team and receiving regular updates on how things were going. He was pleased with the direction the hospital was heading, but he knew that the work wasn't finished. Change wasn't something that could happen overnight, but it was happening, and that was what mattered. One day, several months after the initial confrontation, Keanu ran into Dr. Thomas in the hospital hallway. The doctor had just finished an appointment and was walking toward the staff lounge when he saw Keanu. He paused for a moment, unsure of how to approach him. But Keanu smiled and walked toward him. "Dr. Thomas," Keanu said warmly, "how's everything going?" Dr. Thomas seemed a bit surprised by the greeting but smiled in return. "Much better, actually," he said. "I've been taking the feedback seriously, and I've been working on improving my approach. It's been a lot of work, but I feel like I'm getting better at it." Keanu nodded, genuinely pleased. "I'm glad to hear that. It takes courage to admit when we need to change, and I appreciate the effort you've put into making things better." Dr. Thomas looked at Keanu with a sense of gratitude. "Thank you for giving me the chance to improve. I wasn't aware of how much my behavior was affecting people until you pointed it out. I'm grateful for the opportunity to make it right." Keanu smiled. "We all make mistakes. The important thing is that we learn from them and do better going forward." "It's good to see you taking it seriously." Dr. Thomas nodded, and for the first time, Keanu saw a sense of humility in his eyes. The doctor had come a long way, and Keanu could tell that the journey wasn't over yet. But that was the nature of personal growth. It was a continuous process. Dr. Thomas wasn't perfect, but he was trying, and that was all anyone could ask for. As Keanu walked away, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. The hospital was changing, but more importantly, it was becoming the place he had always hoped it would be. A place where people didn't just receive medical care, but where they felt seen, heard, and valued. And while Dr. Thomas's redemption was just one part of the story, it was a reflection of the larger transformation happening at the hospital. Keanu knew that there would always be challenges to face, but he also knew that with the right attitude and commitment, those challenges could be turned into opportunities for growth. The hospital was stronger than ever, and its future was bright.